Good evening. As we start our webinar tonight, I would like to ask you to join me in a word of prayer. Let us pray. Father God, thank you so much for this third session of our webinar series. We are so grateful for the time that you have given us, the IS family, to reflect on very significant and important issues. Lord, we are really asking for your Holy Spirit to open our minds to these insights that will be presented to us by Dr. Barbara. Please, Lord, use her words, her wisdom, and her expertise to reach our hearts for the great plans you have for us to be able to maximize and realize our full potentials. We pray for the people behind this program. We also pray, most importantly, for the technical staff that are behind our Zoom meeting tonight. Lord, please help us to have a good and stable internet connection throughout the webinar. And thank you for bringing us these people who are watching us online and who are joining us here in Zoom. Father, talk to us, speak to us, and bless our speaker, Lord, and give us all a very beautiful experience tonight as you have blessed us with the previous meetings. Thank you for hearing and answering our prayers. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Welcome to the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies President's Series. I'm Ginger Ketting-Weller, the president of IS, where we prepare leaders for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. This President's Series was developed because many leaders have never been able to access practical training to do their work better. As we ponder the need for co-curricular training, we realized that we needed to start with the family. If leaders do not know how to create healthy family dynamics, it can wholly compromise their work and mission. A happy marriage leaves you free to do your missional work without bearing the burden of unhappiness at home. Healthy parenting skills reduce the possibility that your children will suffer and grow up with wounds while you are out preaching the gospel. Knowing the elements of healthy relationships also equips you to better handle the relationship issues that might crop up in your work. You can be so much more effective in family and mission when you understand these principles. For this series, we have invited an expert to teach us for this 2021 to 2022 school year. Dr. Barbara Couden Hernandez has a background in nursing, as a licensed marriage and family therapist, as a professor in the area of marriage and family, and now as the Director of Physician Vitality at Loma Linda University, where she is also a professor of medical education. In essence, she is a counselor and professor for the doctors who often have to deal with stressful situations where they're expected to be the leaders. What better person to teach us as well? Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, for being willing to share with us from your insight and knowledge about how to develop healthier relationships and healthier families. I am praying that this series will be a blessing to all of us. I pray that you will learn much through the 12 sessions and that your family, your ministry, and your leadership will become much stronger as a result. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ginger, for that very beautiful and assuring, welcome for all of us. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And welcome to the third session of the 12-part webinar series on healthy families happening here at IS. My name is Bethel, and I'm your moderator tonight. We hope you are as excited as we are to learn new things and wonderful blessings for our personal growth and family growth tonight. Before we get to the presentation, let me go through some housekeeping. First, we will have a 15-minute question and answer right after the presentation. So please do not hesitate to type in your questions to the chat box. The chat box is enabled only to accommodate your questions. So please be rest assured that we will keep your identity private. and we will only read your questions. So your questions are really a big help to make this presentation more practical and relevant. So please, for our online audience, you'd also love to hear from you. So please just type in your questions in the comment section with the uppercase letter Q before the question. Lastly, please keep your self-muted during the presentation and your videos off during the Q&A to secure a smooth running program tonight. All right, let's dive right in and turn the time over to Dr. Barbara Hernandez for her presentation on the third topic, growing through life, personal and family development. Thank you, Dr. Barbara. It's your turn.
Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction, and good evening to all of you, and a very happy good morning to those on Pacific Standard Time here in Southern California. I'm delighted to be with you again today, and we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. I'm going to pull my slides up right now so we can get started with these. I'm very happy to talk to you today about some of the, there we go, now we can all see. I'm going to talk to you today about growing through life and the developmental stages that we go through, and a couple other things that we missed out on discussing last month. So we'll talk about those things today and see what we can do to clarify some of the questions that we have. Why is this important to talk about? Well, firstly, it's very, very important to be talking about development, because if we don't understand the development of our children, their developmental stage, when we go to pray with children, it's going to go right over their head. If we don't understand the issues in adolescence and for our teenagers, if we don't understand, we're not going to be able to be as effective when we have conversations with them about very significant things, about their future lives, etc. So we'll be talking about those things so that we understand why it's so important to talk about our development. So first of all, developmental changes. This is really a divine trajectory. The Bible talks about development. Let's look at a couple places. God said in the book of Hosea, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. This is the new Israelite nation. And we know that God's plan for Israel was to become more and more developed, more and more settled, more and more stable, to become a light to others in a very mature spiritual way. The book of Mark, we find these words from Jesus: the earth produces crops on its own. First, a leaf blade pushes through, then the heads of wheat, and finally the grain ripens. Again, Corinthians, the Apostle Paul was talking about the immaturity of the church at that time in Corinth. He said, I fed you with milk and not with solid foods. Of course, we give babies milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it. And even now, you are still not able. So again, this is a developmental reflection that when we become more and more mature in our lives, in our spiritual life, then we can understand that there are these issues to address, that we can bear more things, we can bear up under more things. We're able to manage much better. 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. Again, a reference to not being fully developed, fully emotionally mature. I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. This again is a reference to growing. So first, let's talk about a couple crucial issues that we have to understand when we talk about development. There are two things that we must understand very clearly. boundaries, the concept of boundaries, and the concept of differentiation. These are big, big terms in mental health, certainly in family therapy. And so let's talk about what this means. What are boundaries? You'll see this sign here at the bottom, good fences make good neighbors. These are words from the American poet Robert Frost, who wrote a wonderful poem about life in New England where everyone goes out and fixes these stone walls between their property they might have pushed over a bit during the winter. And in the fall, you go out and you straighten those stone fences, boundaries between properties. Why is that? Because good fences make good neighbors, so that your dog doesn't jump over the fence and go into the neighbor's yard, or that your trees, if the leaves fall into your yard, you rake them up, but you leave the neighbor's yard alone. That was the idea. Boundaries make good neighbors. Let's talk about what boundaries are. Boundaries are this emotional limit, like an emotional fence or a physical fence that distinguishes you, separates you from other people. It delineates what your emotions are from what somebody else's emotions are, what your needs are from what someone else's are, and what your experiences are from someone else's. Now, why is this important? It's certainly important as people of faith because other people have different beliefs than we have. And one of the ways that we are clear about what we believe and what someone else believes is to have adequate spiritual boundaries. There are certain things we do, certain things we won't do, certain beliefs in the grace of Christ, right? That gives us such joy and a different experience, so that when we're with people who are very sorrowful and frightened and guilt-ridden, we don't have to be that way. Part of it is because we have beliefs that are different. Part of it is because we needn't take on the beliefs and the moods of other people. Have you ever been around someone very angry? I've worked with people who, when they go around someone else who is angry and snarky and abrupt, they feel that they have to become serious and worried and angry. Well, you don't, because that's not your experience, that's their experience. And so these boundaries are these invisible lines around our emotions that say, you are who you are, someone else is how they are. We needn't be so placating as to think we have to always be like them. Another reason we have important boundaries is because we decide our responsibilities, what is our responsibility and what is someone else's responsibility. And if we're doing everyone's responsibility, not only will we become exhausted, but we rob that person of the opportunity to learn what their responsibilities are. This is one of the problems that we have with what you might have heard as hover parents. Hover parents are parents who do everything for their child because they don't want their child to have any kind of deprivation of any kind. And in the meantime, they're teaching those children not to know how to work, not to know how to take care of themselves, to problem solve. So boundaries are very important, aren't they? It's a limit we set in relationship with other people. You want me to do what? That's what you might hear. And that's when we think, okay, my boundaries are that I don't do those things. Or you're asking me to do something that is immoral or something that I don't agree with. That's a limit that we set. Or as a parent, if a child is shouting at you, that's a limit. We do not permit that. And that's a limit, a boundary that we set. It distinguishes what is acceptable regarding our beliefs, our behavior, how we spend our energy, our personal space, our possessions, and the way we're treated. You might have heard that there is a private space, an intimate space that's like right within a foot of us. We don't usually have strangers come up into our personal space, which is that 1 foot space, invisible boundary all around us, and talk right in our face or start kissing us. That's a limit around that. That's reserved for specific relationships. And so These are important boundaries for us to all understand. When we have boundaries, it teaches other people how to treat you. So if you permit certain behaviors around you, you're really teaching somebody else how to treat you. I was talking to a manager at the university some time ago, and she said, I have a real problem employee, and he comes into work when he wants. When he doesn't, he won't. When I ask him to do something, he'll say, I really don't want to do that, or else he'll just ignore me altogether. One of the things that went through my mind was, how did he learn that that was acceptable? So we have to think, okay, the things that we say and do really makes a difference in how we are treated. And if you permit people without recognizing the inappropriateness of their behavior, if you allow people to treat you in a certain way without making a clear statement about that in some way, and we'll talk about how to do that in another conversation, then what you're doing is you're allowing them and reinforcing them to treat you in a very negative way as well, which is something that is intolerable. Now, when you're very clear what the boundaries are in a relationship, you're less worried. Your anxiety is reduced. So, for example, if I go into a new place and someone says to me, what we'd like you to do in this setting is we would like you to, after the service, we have some plumbing at the back of the church that isn't working properly. We'd like you to fix that. Let me tell you, my anxiety would be through the roof because I don't know anything about plumbing. And if I were to say, that's a very challenging need you have, and I know you're anxious about getting this repaired. I'm really not a person who knows anything about it. You would not be well served for me to even think about that. Then people would say, oh, okay, I understand that. Or think of it in a relationship, in a romantic relationship. If you're annoyed with someone and someone has treated you in a certain way, if you're not very clear with them, I work best with this, I don't tolerate that, then they say, oh, that's right, I understand that person. They're very clear, they have clear boundaries. Then there's less worry in the relationship. So let's think about how we set those boundaries in a fair way. These are just some examples. Now, think about, I'm thinking about being a parent. And I used to have a very squirmy younger brother who would squirm all through church. So this would be something that could be said by a parent to a child that sets a boundary in a fair and a kind way, because everything is not reason for punishment or harshness. So setting the boundary fairly, you're a very active boy, and I know you don't like to sit still very long. Lots of people are like that. So what you're doing is you're saying, I understand that this is a way that some people are. When we're in church, you'll need to sit still to be respectful. There's a boundary. This is an expectation. We will find something you can hold in your hand that you can quietly play with and still be quiet. So that's setting a boundary. That's an expectation. How about this one? You and I have different thoughts about how to argue amicably. If you use abusive language with me, I will not be interested in discussing politics with you again. So again, this is a clear idea. Of course, we have all kinds of excitement and harshness about politics, elections, about policies. And so some people can get quite exercised about this. And some people can be quite verbally abusive because they feel like they have to come out on top in the argument. And if you allow that, and you don't set a boundary to say, I understand you have a lot of energy about this, and it's unacceptable to be using that kind of language with me, or to be as coercive, or to raise your voice with me. I'm not going to be interested in discussing this with you again. So that's a kinder way to do this. What about administrators? I know you think it's just fine to use drugs, and you don't think it's unsafe to get high. We have a drug-free school policy. So while you're here, that is the expectation. You hear the boundary there? If drug use is reported again, you will be expelled. Would you like to transfer elsewhere now, or will you be able to commit today to no further drug use. So this is a no nonsense, very clear boundary. If, like the Bible says, this far and no farther. We have to set boundaries, and we do that with children. We do that in our intimate relationships. We do that at work, etc. I want to take just a moment and talk about functional boundaries. This is something that we wanted to talk about last month and didn't get a chance to it. Functional boundaries are the functions, the limits on the function that we have within a family. Now, in a family, you can see we have three subsystems. We have a romantic relationship. That is a very privileged relationship that only belongs to the parents in that family. We have a parental subsystem, the executive, the people that maintain the law. Now, within that, you might have aunts and uncles, grandparents, older adults, and the parents. What we know is that that is not a role for the children. That is a role for parents or grandparents. We know that the grandparents, the aunties and uncles, do not belong in that romantic relationship. That's a very private relationship. That's between the two. We're very protective of that relationship. But the parental subsystem, the executive subsystem, who keeps the law, the children who are at that bottom subsystem, they understand, I am a child, I obey, I do what I'm told, I realize I don't know what I don't know, so I lean on the others for information. Now, there is something in families called parentification. Now, let's just say that most eldest children get somewhat parentified. Why is that? A parentified child is someone who might be deputized by the parent as the eldest. They might hear something like, we're going to the store. I want you to make sure that your younger brothers and sisters are all in bed by 8 p.m. And that's the responsibility that's given to the eldest child, to make their younger siblings do that. So for a moment, they have a little bit of transient executive function. However, the problem comes when you have a parent who gives up their executive function altogether. Maybe they're on drugs, maybe they're unable to care, maybe they have medical conditions. And so someone in the child subsystem has to take over the parental behaviors. There was a terrible case in Southern California about parents who were killed in an accident, and the oldest daughter, who was 17 at the time, had 6 younger siblings. She immediately became the parental subsystem. In that family, there was no romantic relationship, so there were only these 2 subsystems. So what happens when a child becomes parentified, more than just being deputized as the eldest to make sure the younger ones mind and the children get what they need in that family? When I worked one time with a young adult woman, she was very serious. She was telling me that as a child, her mother and father were on drugs and they had mental health problems. And so she was the one who would get the checkbook every month and would write the check for rent when she was 9 years old. When she was 9 years old, she was buying the groceries for the family. She was doing everything to take care of her younger siblings because it would not get done. That was an extreme situation. That was a very unfortunate experience. But she grew up very serious, very hyper aware of the responsibility upon her. So she never had the opportunity to be a child. She was immediately thrust into a parental role. And so she had no ability to relax, to let someone else take over, to delegate. All of the responsibility was on her. This makes for a very serious, self-conscious, exhausted, and very intent kind of person. Let's look at another very unfortunate type of boundary violation when in families. Incest and molestation are 2 words that are very dire words, but this is what happens when a child is removed from the child subsystem and moved up into a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship role with a parent or an older person, that child is no longer seen as a child role, or they become quite confused because sometimes they have to behave as a child and other times they have to behave as a very adult type of role. So this is a grave difficulty, a grave, egregious problem that's permitted with children. We can never allow this. This really teaches a child that their needs and their ability to be a child is not as important as the need of someone who's going to exploit them. Now, differentiation is very important. Differentiation is something that teaches us that you are different than I am, that we're separate, that we have different ways of being in the world. Now, I recognize that the norms for explaining how we are allowed to be different are different in the East and Western cultures. And so again, today I'm talking about some general rules that you have to take and apply to your setting, your cultural context, because there is none that are better than another. They're just different. And there are norms within each of those that we have to think about. So differentiation, when we say you're different than I am, even in a family, we have people who are better at some things than others. And it's important to recognize difference within our families. Boundary and limit setting is essential for parents, for partnering, for work, for our social and relationship help. Differentiation, allowing someone to be a unique individual, is really important to give children especially, or people within a congregation, a very strong sense of who they are, their own value, their own norms, their beliefs, their worldviews. We know that Sister White says, do not become a shadow of somebody else. We are all individuals. Boundaries with children and the way we think about children differ and change over our developmental stages. So we don't treat our teenagers the way we treat a 2-year-old. If we do, there's real problems in that family, isn't there? Children become highly anxious in families where boundaries are unclear, where they are not allowed to be unique individuals, because they're always focused on what's going to happen next. How will I know if I've done a wrong thing? How will I know if I get to be this thing? How do I know if it's acceptable to have a different behavior than other people in my family? And there's a lot of unwritten rules in a family that cause children to be preoccupied. Now, I said that differentiation is very, very important. We all have different personalities. We all have different temperaments. Some people are more phlegmatic, more laid back. Other people are much more, the go-getters in a family. I'm thinking back to when we had Harvest In Gathering, where we went from house to house soliciting funds for various community projects and for the World Church, ADRA, etc. Some of us found that just painful because we're very introverted, and I am very introverted. So for me to have to talk to one person after another, and ask for funds was exhausting. I would never be a good salesperson. I would be giving things away. And some of you can relate to that. Whereas other people who are more extroverted, who have a different way of interacting with people, would be just fine with that. For me, it just about killed me. So we have to recognize that in our congregations, in our families, people are different. They have different skills. They have different natural abilities. Now we have different birth order. We didn't talk a lot about this, except to say a few minutes ago that firstborns are great leaders. Your president is a firstborn. I have always worked in nursing settings for firstborn charge nurses, for the ward matron as being a firstborn. They're in charge. They have good skills to do that. I have never known anyone who is a very famous comedian in Hollywood who's not a lastborn in a family. So we have different ways that our roles in families shape us. different things that we do better than others. People like me, who is third born in the family, really prefers to be doing things on my own, kind of off to myself, being left alone, not micromanaged, but not too far away from everyone, just kind of on the edge of things. And I'm happiest in that way. Now, there's generational differences also of parents and children. Some of our parents grew up in families where things were done a certain way. We have to recognize that when we allow for differentiation in our families, we recognize that our children are raised in a very different world than we were. And the meanings are different, the experience is different. We have to have some allowance for that. There are gender differences. Leadership, for example, if a man in leadership does something, it will be seen as resolute. It will be seen as definitive. And if a woman does something when she's in leadership, she might be looked at as being bossy. And we give a lot of different pejorative terms to women in leadership because we're more used to seeing males in leadership. And so we are not always as even-handed. We have different expectations. And there are different expectations for children as well. Some of those are positive, some of those are very unfair. When there are very rigid rules about who gets to be different in a family, then these are all the things that can happen. People can be quite resentful if they're expected to be a certain way that is not in line with their natural way of being. When you really clamp down on someone and you force them to be in a certain way, everyone is uniform in this family, on the inside, something starts to erode and they want to get some distance where they can be who they truly are. Let's make those places our congregations and let's make those places our families, because these should be the safest and the best places to be. So to encourage healthy differentiation, which is important at every developmental stage in life, start asking opinions of your children and your teenagers. Ask what they think about things. Many of us who are parents limit our conversation to children by being instructive. While instruction is helpful, it's important to get children and our congregations to start thinking about things. This is why the small group movement took off in churches, because it's an opportunity for people not just to be preached to, but to be discussing things. You want to affirm people's unique perspective. So if a child says, well, I think this, such and such, say, oh, that's very interesting. Tell me more about that. You want to ask them to explain their ideas and experiences that support their views. This is also good for children to start thinking about why they hold opinions or why they might need to change their opinions. Now, we want to contrast their perspectives with our perspectives and not to say in a triumphal way, well, this is how I think and this is why and it's superior, but to say, here's how I think about it. Now, of course, we think that as parents, what we think, or as pastors, you might think, well, what I think about this is superior. However, what that does is really squelches other people from figuring out what they think. And particularly children, when you dictate to them what they should think. As we're going to see some of the differentiation stages, developmental stages, teenagers don't take very well to that. So gently explain why you think what you think and your experiences that support your views, including your spiritual and moral perspectives. And not to lecture, but to say, oh, I think of it as this, this, and this. And then you can also raise ethical issues with people to say, how do you think about that? What do you bring to that discussion? You want to encourage self-expression and take an interest in their explanations. So why is the thought, why are you thinking this way? Help me understand more about what you think. Often people will not hear what you want to share with you until you've listened to them. And then you share your expectations, your family rules, the family solidarity measures, and you also discuss 1 Corinthians 12. Is everyone an eye? Is everyone a foot? No, we're all different. So differentiation can be a wonderful tool to encourage your family to be very well developed and emotionally robust. Now, as we turn toward our main topic today, which is developmental stages, let's look at some trends that really make a difference in our development. We have something called the boomerang generation. And this is largely because of the economy, because of COVID, young people get ready to grow up and leave a family and start families of their own. But because of the economy, they come back and they live in the family home for a long time, much longer than they typically would. Now, in some families, it's expected that the children will live in the family until they're married. And in the West, that's not the case. And so we find that a lot of adult children are coming back to live with their families of origin. The sandwich phase of life, this is where you have young children and you're caught in the middle of young children, obligations to young children, and obligations to elderly parents. And this happens all around the world where we have two different disparate groups to take care of. People are getting married much later in life. So for first-time marriages, we're finding that people are getting married much later. Now, over 40% of adults in the US are single. This varies by country, but we see that here are some numbers with single individuals, single parents, and some of the numbers that are available. In the Philippines, 15 million single parents 2 years ago, and 1.5 million single parent households in South Korea, and 19.4 million single mothers in China. So this is something that is changing across the world. And so this certainly affects how our families develop. This affects how our children develop. So let's talk about, first of all, individual developmental stages. And this is from the cradle to the grave. We'll talk about this. Now, we all love babies. We have the first stage is from birth to 2 years. And this is where children, babies are, they'll put their toes in their mouth. They're exploring the world with their mouth. Everything goes in the mouth. We had puppies once that, you'd see them chewing on something and you say, spit it out. What is it? And it would be a screw or a bolt from something outside in the work area. Babies put things in their mouth. They're fully dependent. They take in things through their senses, their hearing, their touch, and they're not able to think abstractly, even concretely. They're not able to think as well. And you're really not interested in being differentiated from an infant. They're very dependent. And so it's appropriate that you are with them, you're observing them, you're supervising them at all times. And what children learn, babies learn, is that by screaming or crying, you can get things to happen in the family, right? And this is why we do sleep training at night to get children and babies to go to sleep at certain times. And so this can be a challenge. Now, the next stage is age 2 to 6. This is one of my favorite developmental stages because children are so innocent. They're talking at this point. They do pretend play a lot. They're, let's pretend that we're in the kitchen. Let's pretend that there's, let's pretend we're in a boat. And so they sit on the ottoman in the living room and in the lounge, and they're pretending that they're on a boat. This is a really charming age. They're still quite dependent. They are very concrete thinkers at this point. They don't reason things out as well. They start to draw, they get some motor skills. Now, children ages, up to 6 years, they're not able to multitask as well. Now, children start learning to ride bicycles between 5 and 7 years of age, usually, right? And we tell them, look both ways when you get to the street. Developmentally, they can't hold the handlebars, make their feet go, look both ways, and keep their balance at the same time. It's not very possible for young children. So we often ask children to do things beyond their developmental capability, and then we punish them when they don't do it. They're very dependent still. They recognize that they don't know what they don't know. And so they're expected to obey parents and to do what they're told. Now, this is where they also realize that they can say no. And our 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, they have a phase called the terrible twos. and everything is no, it's because they're starting to learn how to differentiate between what they want and what someone wants them to do. And so it's not out and out defiance that we have to break them, to force them to think differently and stop saying no. Of course, we need to discipline, and we have to make sure that their behavior is held in check, but not to see that as defiance, because they're starting to learn, oh, I can actually exert some influence on what goes on if I pout, if I scream, if I tantrum. And it's our job as adults to put a limit on that. They begin to understand that this is not what we do, but this is what we do. So this is a charming age. This is also an age when, as in the later part of the stage, where children will say things that just leave you abashed. They might comment on the body size. I can think of someone who walked up to a very, very heavy man in church. He was a very fat man. And this little girl, 5 years old, walked up to him and very innocently said, "Why are you so fat?" Well, that's a very good question for a small child who thinks concretely. But it horrified her mother to the point that her mother slapped her face. And she didn't know what she did wrong, because that was what she wondered. So this is an age where children will say all kinds of things. Now, ages 7 to 12, this is the school age time. And they start to read, they're curious, they want to learn everything, they want to understand how things work. They start realizing that boys act a certain way and girls act a certain way, and there's certain expectations for how they behave. And they get friends, mostly of their same gender, so they have same gender peer groups. And so you'll find little kids at this age who have little groups, little clubs. When I was 10 years old, I was part of a club, and we had to make a certain noise to be part of the club. And it was just a very funny thing now that I look back at it. But this is a really fun age. Children want to understand things. This is a time when they ask questions to give them good responses. As they become preteens, they start developing really strong friendships. They start getting their own style of being, their own personalities that is quite unique. They get hobbies. They gravitate toward things that they really like. Puberty begins. Now, interestingly enough, remember during ages 7 to 12, they're curious. They want to know how things work. This is when a lot of the children will start asking questions about reproduction, sex, marriage, kissing, things they might have seen. And they might ask you some very innocent questions during that time. Now, if you are able to give them very age-appropriate, simple responses, then that signals to them that it's fine to ask you questions as the parent. But if you wait till they get to teenage years, or even worse, just before they get married, to have the talk with them about sex and reproduction, contraception, all of those important issues, if you wait, it's too late. And they will not be as comfortable talking with you. So there's a reason that smaller children are curious. You don't want to give them all the information, but simple responses at ages 7 to 12, so that as they walk through puberty and teenage years with all the vicissitudes of relationships, pressure to be sexually involved, they know they can talk to you because they've done it when they were younger. Now, ages 12 to 14, this is when puberty begins. They start getting a bit moody. Dysphoria is a word for melancholy. They start getting melancholy. They might want to go to their bedroom and stay there, and they might be in a real mood. This is very normal, very typical. When it's not normal, that's when they start feeling suicidal, or their behavior is terribly irritable for a long period of time. They tend to be a little bit pushing the limits of parental rules. And so they might start agitating a little bit. And this is all part of differentiating who they are, feeling like I'm a little bit more grown up. I should be able to make more decisions. But we know that they still don't know what they don't know. And it causes great consternation in those of us who are parents. Now we have more information about the 15 to 18-year-old range. This is full-blown teenage years. They are starting to think about who they want to become. They realize that they have a sense of agency. They can be something. They start to develop some sense of self-worth based on how they're treated, their experience with friends at school, how well they fit into their peer group. They become quite focused on becoming independent and having their own views about things. And they might say things to shock you as parents because they want to prove that they're being quite adult. They will ask you questions. They might say, what would you do if I came home and I was pregnant? I remember doing that to my own mother, and I would hear her gasp, and I did it just to see what she would do. And I was not sexually active, but I thought, let's just see how I could be accepted if I did something really outside of the bounds. And our kids do that. They test us. They might challenge parental authority. They might rebel. They might, including the religious beliefs, they might form some kind of intimate relationship that gives them a sense of identity or builds that sense of identity that they're developing. They are particularly susceptible to being exploited. They don't want to come and tell you what's being done to them because they want you to see that they're grown-ups and that they can be trustworthy. And so there's a lot of teenage abuse that happens in relationships because they're embarrassed to say anything to their parents and they don't know what to do. Now, what about adult development? During the ages of 19 to 39, this is where we're focused on trying to develop a partnership, a marriage, to develop who we are as people. We develop a community. This is when we're at our peak physically. I remember moving from one location to another, and within one day I had unpacked all the boxes, put everything away. Now I have to take several days to do that because I'm in my 60s, and it doesn't happen the same way as it did then. This is during this stage we develop who we are sexually, our sexual identification, how we want to present ourselves to the world. We start working at that. We have our own value system. And this is, again, where differentiation is so important because it might have subtle or very pronounced differences from our parents, depending on what we were raised with. Now, much of the therapy that I've done over my life has been with young adults in this stage, whether it's university or college students. And many individuals at this stage are pulling out their parents' values, holding them up, looking at them and saying, I like this part. I'm going to keep this part, but this, I don't know about that. That seems like dogma. And so we find that this is a very common thing that happens at this stage of life. It's very, very normal to be questioning, who am I in relation to how I was raised, my context, my church, my congregation? People start having different kinds of friendships. They have different interests in the future than in earlier years. They have children if they're able to do that, and they try to establish themselves financially. As they get older, we end up to middle age, and during middle age, our children start families of their own. We become grandparents. We start thinking about how now in these last few years of my working life, what can I leave behind that will make a major contribution? So we get a great sense of urgency during this period of time, especially in your early 60s, because we realize we won't be working until we're 90, most likely. And so how can we do something now that makes a difference? We start to see the wrinkles. We start to feel our limitations. We know that the muscle to fat ratio changes. That's a fancy way for saying gravity takes over. We start to bag and sag. We have fat bags we didn't have before. We get turkey necks, wrinkles. This happens as we get older. I like to think of it as just getting softer. one of my grandchildren came up to me and threw his arms around me and hugged me, and he put his head up against my tummy and he said, "Oh, Bubby, hugging you is like hugging a soft pillow on the couch." And I thought, I don't want to be a soft pillow on a couch, but how lovely to be a Nana who is like that. We often by this stage have experienced the death of at least one parent. So we start learning that there's a limitation to our lives. We face our mortality. And some of our friends might have passed away by this time. And we're at the empty nest period. And we'll talk about this next week when we talk about relationships. I'm trying to hurry. We only have a few more minutes. Between age 65 and onward, we're official senior citizens. And this is where we start thinking about, what has my life meant? What have I left behind? How have I been as a parent? How have I been as a citizen? How have I been? What did I leave behind? And this is where, when we talk to our elders, many times they want to tell us stories and share the wisdom that they've learned over their lives, because they want to give this to the next generation. We might have decreased physical capability, decreased mobility, maybe more dependent on others, maybe more socially isolated, and elderly people can be quite lonely if they're not actively pulled in to social situations. And this is where taking care of our elders is so very important, because they've given so much to us, and it's so important to give back and provide a good last phase of life to them. Usually they've experienced the death of a spouse, parents have passed away, and they think of their own death. I'm thinking of when my mother turned 80 years old, her friends had a special tea for her. And so they had the fancy teacups and they had cakes and special things for her. And I was there, I was in my 50s at the time, along with a friend of theirs that was in their 50s. And these ladies, all 85 and above, except for my mother, were talking about how they thought they might die one day. And I looked over at my friend in her 50s, and her eyes were as big as saucers. It was like, this is so macabre. Why were we talking about this? And the ladies saw us and they laughed and they said, it's all right. This is part of how we think now. And we're thinking about these things because we're not going to live forever. And it's a reality. So we're thinking about this, and we trust in God, but we're not worried about this. So there are different sensibilities. Now, I don't want to leave out single people. I was single until late in life, and I think it's really important that single people need to be included in our developmental stages. Now, between 20 and 24, single people, for the most part, are not having children. If you're having children, that's a whole other responsibility, that you have to define who you are, plus who you are as a parent. And so it's very challenging. If you're single and not having children, you're really focused on becoming more emotionally and financially reliant on yourself. You're fielding all those questions like, what's a nice girl like you still single? I used to hate that question. You're trying to be creating meaningful friendship networks. You're trying to find a sense of belonging. This is where the church is absolutely critical, because single people don't have the same ties and responsibilities as married people, and they are devoted, loyal. They often want to have a place to belong. If you have single people in your congregation, use them wisely, because you're giving them a home, a sense of context, a place of meaning, and they are so valuable to us. Many people during the stage between 20 and 40 are coming to terms with being single, hearing their biological clock ticking away the time where they won't be able to have children. And this can be very challenging as well. So coming to terms with the fact that for those who want children, I won't be having children. So what do I do with my maternal or my paternal instincts? How do I live those out? They develop a strong sense of self in the face of unwelcome but well-meaning advice and the inquiries of those uncomfortable with their single status. I just want to give single people a lot of kudos here, because some very well-meaning people are not helpful at all. And what is helpful is to wait until single people bring up those kinds of topics. Singles find meaningful work, find much more meaningful work fulfilling than do married people, because this is where we get our context and this is where meaning occurs. Singles tend to be closer to family members than married people because you don't have a diluted energy, emotional energy. Singles in later life, we know that, here's some facts about this, that over the course of life, singles' general life satisfaction gets greater. Singles who have never married or are less lonely in later life than widows, widowers, and divorced individuals. And if we look at the general life satisfaction of elderly individuals who are not married, it's it's women who have never married who tend to be happier in old age than any other demographic, which is quite interesting. When life stages and life events and developmental stages are out of sync, when suddenly you're an empty nester and you've raised your children, and suddenly one of them meets with a terrible accident and they're dependent on you, suddenly you have to go back to an early developmental stage as a parent to where you are taking care of someone who is very dependent. And you thought you were about to retire, you thought you were about to have some time for yourself. Or what about someone who has early dementia? What about grandparents who are taking care of their children? Same thing. So we have to be mindful that these stages are somewhat difficult. I'm going to just make these slides available. So I'm not going to go through the blended family stages, although this is certainly something that you'll want to take a look at another time once I make the slides available. So just in closing, children need developmentally appropriate educational materials, spiritual education, and conversations in order to fully benefit from what you want to give them. Children need strong models for how to set boundaries with kindness and firmness, because if they don't see you doing it, they will either be very aggressive setting boundaries, or they will fold up and capitulate to whatever someone else wants them to do. We need to recognize that we're all different and we should not be pressed into one way of being. Even in our families, differences and variations should be celebrated. Boundaries allow a strong family structure and a safe place for children to differentiate and to develop without distraction and preoccupation that they're somehow doing something wrong if they're different or unique. Family life requires flexibility at every single developmental stage. Blended family life is rewarding, and it's not for the faint of heart. And once you see the slides that I created on that, you'll be able to see what I meant by that. So this is an overview of how we develop over time. This is a few thoughts about what our children need, what our parishioners need, and how we can meet those needs. So I'll turn that back to you, Bethel, for where you'd like to take us next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. We feel sorry for the time limit. We know that this topic is really huge and big, but you did your best to really give us all the important and necessary basic insights on this. And I know our audience would agree with me in telling that we have always gone out from this meeting full. And we have always become better people at understanding ourselves and our relationships. So now we have a few questions to answer.
Sure.
Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, so here, let's start from the first question. We have here, how can a child stand up for himself or herself when parents do not understand the importance of differentiation, especially when the siblings have significantly opposite personalities, but the parents use the same method, raise, and discipline them? Okay, that's a good question.
That is a very good question. And I think many of the people I see in therapy have had this experience.
Okay.
So this is a very common experience.
Mm-hmm.
So what this tells me is that the parents might have a limited repertoire of parenting skills. And so they might not know how to nurture difference. It might feel to them that difference means defiance, or
Okay.
difference is bad,
That's
or difference,
important.
yes. And so it might be a bit of lack of breadth of capability on the parent side. What this often does is sets up a dynamic where the children become quite resentful and rebellious. And so that as soon as they're able to get away from their parents, they do, and they keep quite a distance emotionally and geographically. And so how a child can stand up for themselves. Now, this is asking a child to do something that adults often can't do. So children can't say and do a whole lot about it, which they realize they have to obey and they have to be respectful. And so it's a rare child who can say to their parent, Mommy, I'm a little bit different than that. And I'm going to obey. It's almost incomprehensible that a child could say that. This is where our teenagers start agitating to be different, to prove that they're different. Our teenage daughter at one point came home from school and said, I'm going to cut my hair in a mohawk and dye my hair green. And I thought, oh, Lord God, how am I going to go to church and sit next to this girl? And it had nothing to do with her any desire. She just wanted to be different.
Okay.
Want to be different, especially teenagers. And so I think to always validate the adult and say, oh, I see, this is what's really important to you. This is how I'm thinking about it. What do you think? But it's a rare child that can do that without looking defiant. And if the parent is not allowing them to have any difference in their lives, it's not going to happen by a child speaking up, unfortunately.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think the word that you said, difference means defiance, is a very personal, especially in an Asian culture or the shame and honor culture. And it's really very hard thing to deal with. Now, second question, this is more on a pastoral side. What advice do you have for pastors who advise families, and most of the time they are not familiar with the family administration and their boundaries? What advice do you have for pastors as they realize individuals are different and yet are responsible to holding the law in church discipline? So how do you have this dealt with?
I'm not a pastor myself. So what I'm thinking, I'm putting myself in the place of a family who might be receiving a pastoral visit.
Okay.
And what I'm thinking is that if you go into a situation in which you're not familiar with how the family runs, it's important to be asking questions or to notice things, or to say, I noticed this, this, and this. What are your thoughts about that? How do you address those things? What have you found to be effective for you? Because let me just tell you, pastors do not know everything there is to know about families, about family discipline. I mean, therapists don't know everything about it. We don't know everything about every type of approach to everything. And so I think it's much more becoming to say, I'm noticing that this is what I'm seeing. Tell me about that. How do you manage this? And like I said before, there's a saying in the rural parts of Texas, which is a real, rural cowboy state in America. And the people there will say there's 100 ways to pluck a buzzard.
Oh.
Which is an awful saying. But what that means is there's a lot of ways to do the same thing.
Okay.
And so if you think about, there might be many, many, many ways to uphold church disciplines, to behave in certain ways, to put limits, to differentiate. There are lots of ways to do that. Go into settings with a sense of not knowing. Asking, tell me what you see, tell me what you do, help me understand how you think about this. Here's what our goal is. How do you think you can make this happen?
Okay. That is so practical. I mean, like for pastors, they don't have to really know everything, but just to know how to ask the right questions, like leading questions for people to open up.
Sure, it's impossible for any of us to know everything.
Right. That is so nice. Now, this is kind of follow-up question from the same person. What advice do you have for pastors to uphold the uniform standard in their advice and counseling, and yet being sensitive to realizing that individuals are different from age groups, cultures, and expectations, especially in urban metro churches? Many times pastors are labeled as being partial or having different standards.
Well,
Okay.
you remember I said in terms of family differentiation, it
Mhm.
it requires maximum flexibility
Wow, I
in
like
order
that.
to be successful, to help people become differentiated. Now, remember, 1 Corinthians 12 talks about differences in the body of Christ and that we encourage that. I
Okay.
think what happens is that when we feel like we're losing control or we're
Mm-hmm.
losing influence, we clamp down on things and we think difference is bad. Difference
True.
means rebellion, and difference does not mean defiance. And so it's so important that we recognize that when we're talking with people, we have to meet them where they are. Sister White said that over and over and over. Meet the people where they are. Jesus met the people where they were.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
so this is something that we all need to learn how to do, whether we're pastors, therapists, nurses, whatever we are.
I think I'd like to highlight on the thing that you said, that the difference that we see in churches many times really shakes the control. But most of us identify this as it shakes our identity. So it's not really the identity that's being shaken, but it's really the control in the system. So thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. Next, can you talk a little more about differentiation between spouses? This is so interesting. For example, when one spouse expects the other one to do things and to spend time and to like the same things as them, how do you recommend addressing or resolving the issues that arise? This is so good.
Well, this is a trick question, isn't it?
Yes.
So this is very tricky. Um, Now, this really depends on culture. This depends on location. It depends
Okay.
on education. It depends on a lot of things. So
Wow.
let me say that there are, in every culture, there are some couples who are together constantly, never separated, always doing
Mm.
the same things. My parents were couples like that. They did everything
Oh,
together. They were constantly together. My husband and I are not like that.
okay.
He has his things he does. I have my things. We're quite parallel,
Mm.
but there are things we like to do together. So every couple is different, and it really depends on the individuals. It depends on what the expectation is. Um,
Okay.
if I felt that I needed to be with someone who did everything and liked everything that I like, for example, um, oh, here's a good example. You hear the term sports widows, and what
Mm.
that is that every time football season comes on, American football, that the men are
Okay.
watching football day and night, and the women feel like widows because they don't
Okay.
want to watch that and they're off doing something else. Um,
Okay.
if I married someone that I had to sit and watch football with constantly, I would go out of my mind. I would not be a good
True.
wife. I would not be a good person. And I think differentiation between spouses, we have to have our own interests, because when we come together and we talk,
Mm.
we're not just mirroring each other. We have something significant to bring to enrich the relationship.
Wow, that's good.
And so if we're only mirroring each other, now some couples can do that where they kind of go lockstep through life and they enjoy that. To them, it means that it means solidarity to them.
Mhm.
That's wonderful, but not everyone is like that. For some couples, that's suffocating. And
Right,
so it's
right.
important, certainly, to decide way before you decide you're going to marry someone, if that's the expectation, and if you're like that. Um,
Mhm.
when you don't want to do something that your spouse wants to do because that's not an interest of yours, again, I think it's important to use that phrase. I notice that this is something that you really like.
Okay.
That's nothing that I've really enjoyed.
Wow.
When you're doing that, I'm going to be doing this. How would you feel about that?
Wow.
And I think there are gentle ways to negotiate that.
Wow, thank you so much. I really like the line that you said, like, it's so important when before getting married, you settle these things out to your partner, then to go on a smooth, married life later, that you know what you're expecting from each other. I think
That's
this is
right.
very helpful. Thank you so much for that. Now, we hope for our children to continue to value our faith through the years when they are differentiating. How can we make sure they do that when they are being more independent from us? Oh, okay.
Well, I have a 2-word response to that
Okay.
breaks my heart to say, but we can't.
Oh, okay.
So let me say something about that. We cannot make sure, but what we can do, because remember, even God lost a third of the angels,
right?
And he was perfect, the perfect father. So we cannot ensure that they will always hold to the things that we teach them. What we can do is create positive spiritual experiences. We can model devotion. We can adjust our behavior so that we're not overbearing and controlling when it comes to this. We can encourage them to think out loud about their faith, and that they understand that what is developing in them is their faith, their spiritual life. It is not something that they owe to us. It's between them and God. Wow. And so we try to encourage that. We give them opportunities to fit and belong in our congregations, and to have a role for which they receive positive feedback.
Wow.
All of those things, when they realize that there's something positive about being part of a faith community, and that there's actually something to be found and appreciated and celebrated in the grace of God and in salvation, then they make that decision to take their faith where they will. What we know in terms of differentiation is that usually in the 30s and early 40s, people swing out from their beliefs that they had as children. They tend to be much more liberal than they were as they grew up. But as they get into their late 50s and 60s, they start swinging back.
True.
So this is a law of nature in general.
Well, thank you for that. And I like to highlight on letting them experience the kind of faith you want them to have, instead of demanding them to do this and do that, but trying to allow them in freedom to explore and navigate on their own on what they really would like to stand on with the choices that we provide them at church. Well, but it requires more creativity on us, not just an imposing thing, right?
It sure does. And we'll actually have a whole session on this later in the year.
Wow, that is so good. Thank you. We're excited on that. Next question. You used the term andropause. What is that? Can you explain it?
Andropause. So we've heard of menopause.
Okay.
Menopause it's not the same thing. Menopause pertains to women, where reproduction stops, where our bodies start having certain changes, hormonal changes. Andropause is something that I've heard in the literature and that we've seen in some men. And andropause is where there is a midlife change. Hormonally for men, testosterone levels start to change, start to become a little less, and they become much more androgynous, so that they're thinking, so men who might have been super masculine and manly and stoic might become more tender and more laid back and more gentle. And so you find that you've heard people say, well, he's really mellowed with age. That's part of the function of andropause.
Wow. Praise God for andropause. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, this is our last question. Second to the last. Can you talk about how physical boundaries might differ by cultures, For example, it seems acceptable for people to kiss on the cheek in some cultures as a way of greeting, although it's not applicable on COVID time. So what can you say about this?
Well, this is really this makes me laugh, this question, because I've traveled pretty extensively, and
Uh-huh.
in some place now where I grew up, you kiss. I grew up in an Italian Anglo household, and
Mm-hmm.
in New York, and so when you meet someone, even for the first time, you kiss them on the cheek, and it's a full lip
Really?
contact on the cheek. You just on one cheek. And so when I
Okay.
traveled to Ireland, you're supposed to kiss on both cheeks, but
Okay.
it's not a full lip contact. And then when I went to Peru, you're supposed to kind of air kiss, not kiss the whole cheek. And so it can
Oh,
be a bit of a booby trap for some of us who are not sure. So there
okay.
are cultural norms. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that what we have to be aware of when we go to other cultural groups, that there are expectations that if we do not abide by
Mm-hmm.
those, we're deeply offensive.
Oh, okay.
And we can be very, very, very offensive in those cultures. And that can really diminish our ministry, that can
Yeah,
diminish our effectiveness, um,
true.
that would very much diminish our influence. So, is there a right way to ever greet people? I mean, I've shaken the hand of people with one hand. That is offensive in some cultures. I've
Mm-hmm.
taken the hand in both hands. That's offensive in some culture. So we
Mm-hmm.
have to make sure we're educated. And
Okay.
if someone does something to greet you that you're uncomfortable with, always be gracious, but step back, smile, sometimes a pat on the shoulder. But we have to make sure we're educated ahead of time about what is appropriate, what is acceptable
Okay, education ahead of time. I like that.
ahead of time.
Ahead of time. So now this is our last question. How can a child, oh, I think this is already, oh, okay. Sorry, I think that was just a repetition of that was just sent twice and I
Yeah,
just
I see. Sure
copy
enough.
pasted everything. So thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. And I would like to check, there's one chat, maybe it's a question. Okay, it's just a comment. She said, well, back in my hometown, we kiss on the cheek and hug each other, but other parts of India, they don't. Oh, so they also practice that. But here in the Philippines, if you do that, it's kind of strange. Very, very
Yes,
strange.
yes,
So yeah, mostly of the Asian culture, especially in like in this part, it's very strange to do that. But
yes.
wow, thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. There is one here. She's trying to, we really are running out of time, but if you could type your question, please do so. We are really very grateful of your time, and like we come out really full, and I believe the IS community is really very, very blessed to have you for a year. Can you imagine? And you wake up so early for us every third Sunday. So here is the question. Can you just take this one,
Of
please?
course, of course.
What is a good topic to talk with adult for spiritual growth? So I remembered the age group for this adult group. So what do you think is a good topic to talk with adults for spiritual growth?
Does that person mean about it just in general or about differentiation or?
I think more on a general thing, because
So
she's
for
more focused on spiritual growth of
so what
individuals.
enhances spiritual growth for
I think
adults?
so. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a wonderful question. And I think that's
Right.
one that certainly pertains to pastoral responsibilities, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of people who really want to talk about applying the gospel to their own personal and emotional
Wow.
lives.
I like
So I
that.
think that many times we talk about religion in a very theoretical sense. Here's our set of beliefs. Let's
Mm-hmm.
memorize those. Let's give those pat answers to things. And that is not nearly as useful as bringing it home to
Okay.
our own personal experiences. So, for example, it might be helpful for someone to give a testimony and to talk about here's how I learned about the grace of Christ.
Yeah.
Or here's what I learned about the fact, and I actually had this conversation with someone just a little bit ago, where many of us have thought of God as an angry grandfather, but Jesus is nice,
Mm.
but God is that angry grandfather, and he's going to intercede with God for us because he's such a
Oh.
horrible, frightening God. And that was a conversation I had with someone not long ago, where for some reason I had been reading where Philip said, "Show us the Father and it will suffice us." And
Mhm.
Jesus said, "Have I been with you so long?"
Right.
And it dawned on me that if God the Father could have come and done exactly what Jesus did, and we wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between the two of them in terms of his love, his grace, his kindness. And then I was able to talk in this conversation about what that did for me and for my own
Wow.
understanding and for what that does for how I approach people and how it changed me. And so I think anytime you get people to talk about
Mhm.
what happens with them, how they apply the gospel, then they have something, as Ellen White says, something straight to the point.
Right. Wow, thank you so much for that. I think it speaks so much with stories for this generation, personal experiences, and I really like those points. Thank you so much again,
You're
Dr.
most
Barbara.
welcome.
Please accept our gratitude on this time that you have given us. And before we close, again, I would like to give this invitation to everyone to join us every third Sunday of the month. We started last August and we will end up to July 2022 next year. So please mark your calendars for this. And all the presentations, we will be filled by the expertise, wisdom, and knowledge of Dr. Barbara Hernandez. So we are really so blessed. And please know also that this presentation is recorded. So you can find this through our two media platforms, the FB with IAS and YouTube with IAS Media. So please, if you have time, review these presentations and take note and apply this in our ministry as it is purposed to be. So again, see you all on November 21st, 2021 with a topic. This is so lovely. I hope our single people and married people will flock on this topic. Love designed to last. Ensuring a happy love relationship. It's not yet Valentine's Day, but we will talk about ensuring a happy love relationship. So friends, this concludes the webinar. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month for the next presentation. God bless you all.